Good evening. My name is Ewa Ciszewska. I am the manager of the NECS conference. I would like to welcome you in Łódź and invite you to those people thanks to whom we are here. I'd like to introduce to you Professor Piotr Stalmaszczyk, Dean of the Faculty of Philology.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our faculty, to the university, to Łódź, and to the very conference. The theme of the conference, which joins the old and the new, the traditional and the modern, is emblematic of our faculty, which, because of its media studies, film studies, is at the same time in the forefront of research in Poland and Europe, and at the same time, in this traditional city, it combines the two elements. This building is a new building. As the Dean of the Faculty, I have to mention it, so please take a look around to the most modern building of the university, the most modern one for the time being in Łódź. So you are most welcome to enjoy your time at the conference in Łódź, at the faculty, and congratulations to the organizers. Well done so far, and hope you'll have even more fun. Thank you very much.
Professor Ryszard Kluszczyński, head of the School of Media and Audiovisual Culture, University of Łódź.
Good evening. I'm also very happy to welcome you at our university. I hope, I should rather say, I'm sure that you are going to have very interesting, fruitful discussions, good networking, and I hope that you will remember your stay in Łódź very good. Thank you.
Professor Mirosław Filiciak from University of Social Sciences, SWPS from Warsaw.
Hello, I would like to welcome you on behalf of course organizer, University of Social Sciences and Humanities. I'm very happy we could be the part of this great event. I would like to thank the local Łódź team, especially Ewa. And I wish you a great time and inspiring time here in Łódź, and see you around. Thank you.
Jarosław Suchan, the chief curator from Muzeum Sztuki in Lodz, our general partner.
Good evening. Welcome all of you in Łódź. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting our institution to be a partner, a general partner of this amazing conference. We are really proud to be a part of this great event, especially because of the topic of this conference. The archives are at the very center of our interest, at the very center of our artistic, curatorial, and institutional practice. So it's really important for us to discuss this topic. I do hope that in the next days we will all have very vibrant and fruitful discussions. And I know that the schedule is pretty tight, but hope that in spite of that you will have the time to enjoy the city and of course to visit our museum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Patricia Pisters from the NECS steering committee.
Yes, I would like to thank you, especially the organizing committee, on behalf of the steering committee of NECS. We know that it's always a lot of work, and we also depend on European local organizers as a community as a whole. And so we just want to express our thanks to this wonderful organization, which, you know, and to receive us in this beautiful, beautiful building. I think it is the newest building we have ever been into so far. Maybe in a science fiction version we will move to even more modern forms. I also would like to welcome all of you. We of course have already been exchanging thoughts for a whole day and more to come. So welcome, thank you, and we're looking forward to continuing our collaborations.
Thank you very much. Please stay a little while. I'd like to thank our partners and sponsors, the Polish Academy of Science, National Science Center, Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, Łódź Urban Initiative Association Topografie, Marek Edelman Dialog Center, Fabryka Sztuki, National Audiovisual Institute, Educational Film Studio in Łódź, Opus Film, and special thanks to Jerzy Czubak. That are our sponsors and partners, and we are very grateful for their support. Thank you for being here. Now I would like to introduce to you Giovanna Fossati, our keynote speaker, and Łukasz Biskupski from the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Warsaw. And I would like you to start your conversation and our main point of the evening.
I think the microphone works, no?
It does.
Yeah, it does, okay.
And just a small organizational remark. After the keynote speech, there will be a small drink that you are invited to. And after that, you are invited to Daleko Blisko Coffee Club, which is located in Piotrkowska Street. And you will be given a leaflet while you are leaving the aula with the address, so we can go there. And we are offering 100 free drinks for the customers who will go to the pub. And I hope to meet you all over there. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Łukasz Biskupski. It's an honor to be here and be able to host the discussion with Giovanna Fossati. Giovanna is the chief curator of art at the I Film Institute in the Netherlands, also a new institution as concerns the building in Amsterdam devoted to film heritage. She is also the professor of film heritage and digital film culture at the University of Amsterdam. And she also leads and teaches the master's course at the university, which is devoted to the film preservation. Her main areas of specialization and research are the digitization of cinema and film heritage, theory and practice of film archiving, and film archiving, restoring, and access. And also, we'll also talk about this, the color in silent cinema. So Giovanna is the author of a very important book, From Grain to Pixel, the archival life of film in transition, published by the Amsterdam University Press. The first edition was in 2009. The second edition. You can order the book at the Publishers Forum, so it's a kind of a product placement. Recently, Giovanna has published one of the book about Fantasia of Color in Early Cinema, which is a wonderful album, which also devotes some attention. And currently, Giovanna is working on several projects, also on the new edition of the book From Grain to Pixel, which will be this new thinking about this situation will be also the topic of our conversation today. And also, she's working on a new edited volume, which is titled "Exposing the Film Apparatus, the Film Archive as a Research Laboratory," which is credited with Annie van den Ever. Sorry if I hope that's the right pronunciation. And the book is forthcoming and should be published this year. And this is a second keynote during the conference, and maybe I could just a short word for the explanation of the word conversation here, because we are already after several sessions, several panels, and several papers, and we are thinking about diversifying the format of our meeting. So what we would like to offer here today is more dynamic and dialogical situation. So we'll have a conversation with a direct and online. Sorry for the word, exchange of ideas, and you are also invited for the conversation. There will be microphones going around, so I hope it will be informative and entertaining situation at the end of the day. And the starting point for our conversation will be a presentation by Giovanna, which will set the field for our conversation. So after that we will have this conversation moment for us. So Giovanna, please, and the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Łukasz, for this presentation. Before we move to a dynamic conversation, you will have to bear with me for my presentation. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the organization for inviting me and for putting together a great program. Many thanks especially to Eva and Łukasz for being so great hosts, and thank you. So let's move to my PowerPoint. Central to my presentation today and to my work every day is the question, what is film heritage? And how we can address this question by bridging the theoretical discourse carried out in the academic context and the practice that is taking place in heritage institutions. In my daily work, academia and heritage institutions are two specific places, namely the University of Amsterdam and Film Museum. Today I would like to start by my talk by briefly reviewing the theorization of film archival practice that I've proposed in my book From Grain to Pixel. From there, I will move to further reflections on such theorization and to some new ideas I have been working on recently. I would like to share this with you now that they are still in an early stage of conceptualization. In conclusion, I will touch upon a number of recent film heritage projects in light of the theoretical framings that I've introduced to you. So the digital turn and the renewed theoretical questions with regards to the nature of film were the main issue I had in mind when researching and writing From Grain to Pixel. My ambition was to bridge film theoretical questions such as what is film, is the digital changing the nature of film, with questions on film heritage, such as, with the shift to digital, what are the objects film archives should collect, and how can they best be preserved, restored, and presented. I felt, and I still strongly feel, that acknowledging the interplay between film archival practice and the theory of film and new media, and bridging theory and practice, is particularly urgent today that technology, expertise, and the conceptualization of film are changing so rapidly. Today, more than ever, the archival life of film, that is what happens to film heritage once it enters the archive, needs to be opened up for discussion. As a curator of a large national institution, I feel the need to consider everyday activities and short-term policies as elements of a broader and broadly shared discussion. Only in this way it is possible to conduct a balanced negotiation with ever-changing political and economic pressure and work towards goals that will make sense also to future generations of archivists, researchers, and audiences. In this line, I subscribe to Daniel Rodowick's 2014 book, Elegy for Theory, where he reaffirms the role and importance of theory today and points out that theory is, quote, present more than ever in our thoughts about moving image. One consequence of the rapid displacement of photography by digital processes has been to fuel a new and welcome fascination with the history of film theory. As if desiring to recover or to re-experience the intense aesthetic pleasure and the ontological curiosity of artists and writers who lived and witnessed the first 30 years of film's virtual life. Unquote. And I also subscribe to David Thorburn and Harry Jenkins' plea for, quote, pragmatic, historical informed perspective that maps a sensible middle ground between the euphoria and panic surrounding new media, a perspective that aims to understand the place of economic, political, legal, social, and cultural institutions in mediating and partly shaping technological change. To support a discussion on film heritage between theory and practice, we need first to understand the technology, analog, digital, hybrid, available today to filmmakers, film archivists, and restorers, as well as the presentation platforms for film heritage available to curators. In addition, I feel that both archivists and scholars need to understand and critically accept the new tools available for research, such as computational analysis of archival datasets and of digitized objects. More in general, it is crucial to take into account the changing expectations of the public with regards to heritage. Such cultural pressure has a great influence on the role of heritage institutions, for example, by stimulating archives and museums to open up their vaults, by making access to collection a political and institutional priority, and by allowing public participation to heritage. As a consequence, the question, what is film heritage, needs to be readdressed, and heritage professionals need to rethink their practice and be able to explain what, why, and how they do what they do in a more transparent way. For these reasons, a dialogue between scholars and professionals is particularly urgent today. And I'm glad to say that this year's conference, NECS conference, is the ideal forum, I'm falling down, to start and promote such a dialogue. In From Grain to Pixel, I have addressed the question, what is film, and by analogy, what is film heritage, in the technological and cultural shift to digital. And I have argued that there have always been many different interpretations of the nature of film and different ways to approach film archival practice. Film archivists and curators have always made choices with respect to what to preserve, what and how to restore, and what and how to present. By analyzing the cultural, aesthetical, economic, and social framing of the choices made in the archival practice, we come to recognize different frameworks at play in the field. I'm going to address this briefly. I have defined 5 relevant theoretical frameworks which can function as a grid upon which a theorization of archival practice can be built. The film as original framework defines the historical film artifact as the carrier of film's authenticity once it has entered the film archive. Within this framework, reading the concept of original, as discussed by Walter Benjamin in 1936, through its analysis by Boris Groys in 2002, it can be argued that each copy of a film does acquire authenticity as it is a new manifestation of the film's lifeline. The film as original framework could lead to opposite archival practices. On the one hand, the original artifact could be considered so precious to become untouchable and not directly accessible. On the other hand, access to the original artifact could be deemed as an irreplaceable experience and thus be fully granted, with the consequence that the original artifact's deterioration would be accelerated. In reality, most archives currently carry out a policy in between these two extreme practices. The film as art framework lies at the foundation of many film archives, and in particular of those with a specific mission of preserving avant-garde films or films of a particular filmmaker or auteur. Within this framework, the focus is typically directed towards the conceptual artifact, the film as it was intended by the artist. However, there are cases where the material artifact can also be closely related to the auteur. In avant-garde cinema, for instance, the filmmaker may use the film as a canvas, as in the case of Oskar Fischinger. It is important to point out that, especially in recent years, while many film artists have moved to digital, others have conversely rediscovered analog film, as in the case of Tacita Din, among many others. Film as state-of-the-art is a framework with a stronger relationship with filmmaking practice than with a theoretical discourse. This framework is based on the idea that one of the driving forces in filmmaking is the search for pushing the limits of technology in order to translate ideas into moving images. Throughout film history, there are many examples of filmmakers, cinematographers, special effects engineers, challenging contemporary technology and striving for new means to realize their visual ideas. Many have contributed to redraw the limits of the medium, and their work has often ended up in the film archives. Relevant examples for this framework are the studio's archives, because of their consistent use of the most advanced technologies available for film preservation and restoration. The film as dispositif framework derives from Jean-Louis Baudry's apparatus theory from the 1970s, as recently reelaborated by Frank Kessler, among others. Film as dispositif places film exhibition, that is the film, the apparatus, and the audience, as central. Therefore, all archives with a strong tradition of film exhibition are bound to reflect on it. Indeed, early cinema and other older media forms were also experienced within dispositives alternative to classical cinema, as it is the case for the experimental and expanded cinema. And it is even more the case today with the transition to digital and the multiplication of new possible dispositives that come with it. More recently, I have reflected on the film as performance framework, an approach to film heritage that has also been discussed in recent publications by scholars Barbara Fluckinger and Vincent Hediger. This framework opens up the discussion to a broader, even more ephemeral dimension than that of the film artifact, its projection, and the dispositif. Indeed, it includes the elements that make each performance of a film a unique event, and in that sense bears similarities to music, as pointed out by Hediger in his 2011 text, Original Work Performance, Film Theory as Archive Theory. In the restoration and exhibition of film heritage, the interaction with other concurrent performances is not yet properly addressed, and projects that take into account the performative dimension, typical, for instance, of some experimental film, but also of early cinema, are still an exception. An example of this approach is the Crazy Cinématographe, a project of Trier University and the Cinémathèque de la Ville de Luxembourg, which since 2007 has recreated the experience of a traveling program performing early cinema at various fairs across Europe. Unfortunately, they stopped with it. Let me now move to the shift in focus since from grain to pixel. There, I focused on film restoration and presentation of restored films as representative practices among film heritage activities that I consider particularly productive for bridging theory and practice. I felt that the restoration practice was still too little understood by those who are not directly involved with it, and too little explained by those who are dealing with it on a regular basis. I also felt that understanding the technical possibilities and the consequences of their application for the theoretical discourse on film's nature was the first necessary step to facilitate a dialogue on film archival practice. At the same time, I thought that focusing on recognizable film titles rather than on other film-related objects would have been more effective in creating a common ground for discussion. Now I'm shifting my focus to a broader and more integral view on film archival practices, as I feel that film restoration and presentation, which are indeed the most visible and therefore most commonly discussed activities within archives, cannot be isolated from the rest of the activities around film heritage. My reflection and research has moved in this direction, searching for a more abstract theorization to analyze, discuss, and as much as possible influence film heritage practice at large. Not only by focusing on restoration and presentation, but also by looking at acquisition, selection, digitization, innovative tools for data mining, new online and on-site forms of access and presentations, and already today in the several panels we've seen many interesting examples of such projects. Also, in terms of objects, I've moved from privileging films as the focus of my reflection to considering film heritage as an integral corpus that includes film-related collections, as well as what can be broadly defined as intangible heritage. In this line, I have identified, and would like to start introducing here, three conceptual framings that can be particularly productive, namely monument, document, event. The conceptual framings of monument document, in particular, bear a strong relationship with the tradition of Nouvelle Histoire scholars. I'm referring here in particular to the work of historian Jacques Le Goff and his discussion of the mixed concept document-monument, when he stated that the main goal of an historian is, quote, to critically assess a document as if it were a monument. Indeed, any document has been materially altered by an editing process affected by the society and era that produced it. And it is also an interpretation in itself, a product of later eras during which the document lived, or was perhaps forgotten, during which it was retouched, albeit by silence. Document is monument, unquote. The tradition of Nouvelle Histoire scholars and their rejection of earlier positivistic approaches to the study of history that focused on monuments, such as big political events having great name as their main actors, bears a clear connection with the new film history, as described by Thomas Elsasser in 1986, which similarly marks a shift in focus towards the document and the rejection of the earlier tales of the pioneers and teleological recounts of first times. In addition, and of great importance here, is that the new film history movement marks not only a turning point in film studies, but also part of the background against which film archivists and scholars started a dialogue in the late 1970s. A dialogue that is still very influential today, and I'm referring here to the FIAF conference held in Brighton in 1978. Other than document, monument, event relates to a different tradition than that of the Nouvelle Histoire's événement, typically the political event, criticized by Nouvelle Histoire scholars as being for too long the only focus of historiography. The event I'm thinking of is in line with Thomas Elsasser's discussion on new direction for research and archiving in his 2009 text, Archives and Archaeologies, the Place of Non-Fiction Film in Contemporary Media, when he remarks that, quote, a notion of film as event is preferable to the traditional idea of film as text. The event has its own temporal and spatial coherence, but as a process and usually tied to a site. An event is linked to a time structure, not as a continuum like narrative, but as pulsed, intermittent, and shaped by intervals. Events as spaces tend to be centrifugal, multi-layered, and heterogeneous in their consistency and materiality. An event implies the notion of programming and planning, but also of accident and coincidence. Document, monument, and event are at the same time three distinct framings and three overlapping filters through which the same object can be interpreted. These framings can also open up the way to include other approaches to film heritage preservation than the ones typical of the Western world, as well as a better integration of intangible heritage. In the scope of this paper, there is no time to further articulate such possibilities, but I would be happy to do that in the discussion further. I would like now to quickly review a few projects in light of the Framings Monument Document event. As this is still a work in progress, my aim at this stage is just to provide food for thought for a discussion, and hopefully we will start right away with Łukasz and you all. A common thread running through the following examples will be that of the Jean Desmet collection, preserved at AI in Amsterdam. This collection contains the archives left behind by Dutch film distributor and cinema owner Jean Desmet, and consists of approximately 900 films, 100,000 documents from the company archive, around 1,000 posters and 1,500 photos. So let's start, before moving to the Desmet projects, let's start by looking at what can be identified as recognized monuments of film heritage, and mention what can be considered as the benchmark of film heritage monuments in the traditional artifact-driven Western perspective. So, do you recognize this? Well, Fritz Lang's Metropolis stands out as one of the most celebrated and most frequently restored film titles in the history of cinema. And as such, the first film to be included in the UNESCO Memory of the War Register in 2001. Interesting to point out is that, probably because of the artifact-driven approach, UNESCO registered a particular restoration of Metropolis. That is the first full digital restoration carried out in 2001 under supervision of Martin Kerber. This choice excludes, therefore, earlier and later restorations, as well as the broader tangible and intangible heritage related to this title. This image, it's from the Desmet collection, and an image of a photo of an advertising pushcart of the Danish film The Great Circus Attraction from 1912 that was playing at the time at the Jean Desmet's Parisian Theatre in Rotterdam. So now, moving to a more complex example of monument, let's look at earlier mentioned Desmet collection, which in the past decades has become of key importance to research on early silent cinema, for the unique objects, the films and the posters, but also for the richness of the associated business archive. As such, the Desmet collection is a fascinating example of the mixed framing monument document. Because of these features, the collection was inscribed in UNESCO's Memory of the World Register in 2011. Since then, the collection has been completely restored and digitized, and has been object of several scholar researches, as well as archival presentation projects. The digitization of the Desmet collection has led to the multiplication of the collection's monuments, the new digital version of its objects, as well as to an abundance of digital documents, like the data sets that have been created throughout the years to describe the different elements in the collection. A recent project has made a first attempt to map these data sets. The project Data-Driven Film History, a demonstrator of EYE's Jean Desmet collection, explores the potential and the limits of digital methods for the research of early cinema collections. The project involved a number of researchers from the University of Amsterdam and Utrecht, staff from EYE Film Museum, and 2 technical partners. In the project, a tool has been developed for studying the distribution, the screenings, and the stylistic features of the films in the collection. This tool allows to visualize their distribution and screening patterns. In line with the mixed framing monument mentioned earlier, a project like this provides new valuable insights into the quality of the available metadata, which often were produced with different objectives in mind. It also highlights how metadata affect the film historical insights. As recently pointed out by Erika Bolsom, discussing the installation The Clock by Christian Markley, museums are borrowing elements of performance arts to, quote, lend qualities of singularity, contingency, and authenticity to a museum visit, unquote. Bolsom further refers to Dominique Paigny, remarking that such events include, quote, the time of the image and the time of the viewer who encounters it, unquote. And yesterday we saw some very fascinating examples of projects that are at the same time monuments, documents, and events in Krzysztof Wodiczko presentation, especially events such as the Abraham Lincoln War Veteran projection at Union Square in New York. So in this line, we can look at the exhibition Jean Desmet's Dream Factory, The Adventurous Years of Film, held at EYE last winter and co-curated by Mark-Paul Meyer, Marente Blumhovel, and Jaap Guldemond. This exhibition, with its multiple screenings in one open space, showing a large selection of films from the collection, and all shown at cinema quality from different angles. This exhibition is not only a document of the riches of the collection and a monument of the unique objects it contains, but also an event that translates the excitement of moving image experimentations typical of early cinema to contemporary audiences. In conclusion, the theoretical frameworks elaborated in From Grain to Pixel recognize and strive to comprise different and at times conflicting assumptions of the nature of film heritage, leading to different ways to archive, preserve, and present it. They are intended to function as the grid upon which a theorization of archival practice can be further built. The framings, monument, document, and event are meant to add a new dimension to the grid, to further help us discuss and analyze film heritage practices at large, and propose new directions that will inform the discourse and the practice in the future. I feel this is very urgent today as heritage and film heritage with it, also thanks to the new possibilities offered by digitization, is receiving a lot of attention by policymakers at national and international level. It is extremely important that a well-informed discussion takes place between researchers and archivists, so that we will be able to provide together the basis for a sustainable policy for the field in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Giovanna, very much. So, maybe we can have a seat here. Thank you for your presentation and the introduction for our discussion. Basically, we are intending to frame this discussion as the title in the catalog says. We will be talking on preservation, restoration, and presentation. So I think of film heritage. So that can be the general plan for our discussion. And the starting point can be your book, From Green to Pixel. So the subtitle of the book is The Archival Life of Film in Transition. And the transition here is understood as the most important concept, which is digitization of film heritage. And you argue that we need a theory that bridges the worlds of film archivists and film scholars, because it's our common interest to understand the process of digitization in order to react to the ongoing changes. And you are proposing a common language that helps both film archivists to perform, and this is kind of theory of practice for film preservation, but also at the same time it's a common language or common mindset for understanding this situation and provide the informed action on both sides. So the idea is to bridge the gap between those worlds. And what you offer is this mindset is completed or consists of several aspects. So the argument goes.
It's okay.
So you start in the book with describing the technical changes within the film production and the restoration that influenced the film archiving, which happened as the period the book covers, it more or less between 1997 and 2007. And then you offer those frameworks which you presented. So that's film as original, film as art, film as dispositive, and film as state of the art. Later you offer some concepts that link it to the common theoretical discussion. So you link this concept of convergence, remediation, simulation to this theory of archival practice. And then you test this framework on different institutions, or as you call it, relevant social groups who are also the actors in this network of film archiving and thinking about film archiving, accessing it. So archives and laboratories. So we show how with this mindset we can understand the situation with archives and laboratories. And then you test it in case studies on different films and different preservation projects. So that's how the structure basically goes for the book. And then, as you explained, you extended your thinking on different areas. But I think we could start from the broadest and most important issue, I think, that the role of the archives, because the archives form the material conditions for the knowledge production in general, but it's also in film and media studies. And here the best known example is how, for example, the policy and the archiving practice of Museum of Modern Art formed this modernist film canon, which then was formed, was transparent, and then was problematized. So it's very important to understand, and also as you argue in the book, that theorists should know what drives archival policies and understand the archival theory, because that's the basis for the knowledge production in the field. So what's the situation with the digitization and archives?
What the situation? Let me, because at this point, I think I need to point out a couple of things. First of all, that this book by now it's old. It has been written in 2009 and had a reedition in 2011 with minor changes. So especially the description of the technological landscape is definitely changed a lot. That's why I'm working on a revised version. On the other hand, the reason one of the reasons why I thought it would have been interesting to write a book like this was because even before the digitization, even as a student, more years ago than I wish to remember, I felt that the whole film archival field was very difficult to understand, map, if you will. I felt there was a very monolithic identity, and there is. It's very much bound to a specific tradition, the FIAF tradition, the International Federation of Film Archive, and some leading archives, and a scarce production of archival text that have been seen as the leading text on film archival practice for a long time. So especially within the master program, Preservation and Presentation of the Moving Image at the University of Amsterdam, which started in 2002. And the many questions we always heard from students that had a hard time linking the theory they were studying within the context of film study and media study programs with the everyday practice in film archives. I thought that linking these two words was really important. And I don't know, you mentioned I provide a language. I don't really think I provide a language, but I kind of try to provide a common ground where this language can be developed. And I think that these are two fields, the media study fields, especially film studies, but at this point I really think that it's beyond only film. Film is part of definitely a broader landscape. And the field of archivists, media archivists, not only film archivists. There are so many overlapping interests that many more collaborations should be taking place than we used to see in the past. But I'm happy to say that it's happening, and a conference like this is a very good example that there is interest. Of course, a conference like this, in my most optimistic hopes, would see not only media scholars, but also a large number of archivists. And there are a few. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm trying to follow up on your comment.
The positive program is to relate archivists and scholars. And is there any aim, or did you write your books against something?
Not really against something, but as I mentioned earlier, as a student and as a teacher at the master program, I thought that we needed to fill some gaps. And without any, I'm not, so the way you phrase it, I need to rephrase it. I wasn't writing against anybody, but there are very important texts in the film archival field that are very important, and I'm talking about old text. I mean, we are still referring to the early film restoration texts written by Raymond Bord, or the later tradition, more philological tradition coming from the Università di Bologna, with Canosa at the university, or Farinelli and Mazzanti at the time at the Cineteca, or Paolo Cherchiusai. So very important text, but there was nothing that was mapping the broader landscape, placing this text within a broader framing. And that's what I tried to do with the book.
There's an ongoing debate, which we'll also take as a starting point, between that nature of the transition from analog to digital. And there's this, as you said and explained, a lot of essentialism and nostalgia between thinking about moving from analog to digital, when the analog or photochemical technologies, as one theorist said, the shroud of Turin, which has this indexical relation with the world, and the digital is dispatched from this relation. And you argue for the more complex understanding of this dichotomy of analogy and digital. And you argued, as you put it, the restoration is simulation. What does it mean? Could you elaborate it? What's your point here?
Okay, let me, before we tackle the simulation part, let me address a little bit the analog-digital discussion. At the time when I was researching and writing the book, within the film archival community, that was the only thing it was discussed. Analog versus digital. So in that sense, now going back to your question, were you writing this book against something? I was probably also writing out of getting bored of always hearing the same discussion. Now things have changed a lot since then. The discussion is much more complex than that, but it's still there, and it's a discussion revolving on very, very fascinating ideas. For instance, the whole question around medium specificity, etc. So it remains a very important issue. On the other hand, it's also not always in sync what's going on in the practice of film archiving, but also in the way media studies are evolving. So said that, the simulation concept in the book, actually there are two moments where I refer to simulation. Simulation is one of the concepts I propose as different concepts from which the film restoration practice can be approached, linking to different laboratory practices. But earlier on in the book, I mentioned simulation as a way to describe what restoration in film's terms always is, pointing out that there is not real distinction between simulation with analog technology or simulating with digital technology. You are always translating an original artifact in some other technology. You do it photochemically from a nitrate film hand-colored to a contemporary color film stock, or you are doing the same simulation but with digital tools. And my argument is very much that the difference here is that with digital tools you can simulate your original. You have more tools to simulate an original effectively. In other words, digital tools, as we all know, are much more flexible than photochemical tools. So this is the way I use simulation in the text.
You did a lot for scholars to understand the technical and material aspects of the film restoration and preservation. The situation changes very rapidly, so maybe we could, and you indicate some major problems with the digitization now, that we have the situation that there's no standardization for the archiving process. That even though we have the technology to scan films, for example, in very high resolution, much higher than 2 or 4K, we don't have money to do it on the regular basis, and as concerns the archival practice. Because, for example, to make the scan fully contain all the information needed, it's it's 6 terabytes for one film, so it's very expensive to store it. And so you elaborated on a lot of technical problems and this general policy concerning archiving as this moment of transition. So now, this 10 or a little bit less, around 10 years later, does this transition from grain to pixel finished, and the problems overcome?
No.
Overcame?
No, and in that sense, I know you don't like the definition transition very much. We discussed that, and you almost forgot it when you mentioned the title. But what I argue very strongly is that it's not about where we are heading. It's all about transition in itself. And I argued it very strongly, as I see it as really an inherent characteristic of film, even before the transition to digital, and which I see as one more transition within film history. That said, things have changed very much since, so my research pretty much stopped around 2007, 2008. At the time, digital was there everywhere at all levels of filmmaking and film archiving practices, but it was still definitely a minority, or still not the dominant technology. Things have changed dramatically since 2011 and 12, when film distribution network moved to digital. So based on the DCI specification, the Digital Cinema Initiative, which is a group of Hollywood studios mainly that decided what are the needed standard for distributing film digitally.
And not archives, for the studios, not for the archives, also for the business.
Of course, so their main purpose was to create a safe, not necessarily the best quality, but a safe network for distributing new films digitally. So that happened in Europe and definitely in the Netherlands in 2012 with the digital rollout. All cinemas moved to digital, and because most even art houses cannot afford to keep both system film projection and digital, basically they all moved to digital. That's the case in other European countries, France as well, and so things changed radically about 3-4 years ago, and that had a major consequence for the production of film stock. You can imagine, Kodak used to produce millions of meters of new stock to distribute the new Batman films all over the world, and now that's not needed. So, Kodak filed bankruptcy. They still exist, but it's a completely downsized company compared as what they used to be. Fuji only produces one kind of film stock. On the other hand, what happened is that because of this sudden, although expected change, a renewed interest for photochemical technology, also thanks to artists. And I mentioned Tacita Dean. She had this very important article, a plea for keeping photochemical technology alive in The Guardian at the time of her, no, a little before her film exhibition at the Tate in London. Anyway, because especially for this lobby of film artists and a few big filmmakers, and not the last is Christopher Nolan, who expressed his feelings for film, traditional film only recently. A few companies started producing films. For instance, well, Agfa is not new, but they are very strong in producing film stock. I'm not saying that this is a long-term sustainable alternative. I think it will remain a niche. So what analog digital was in the past will completely shift towards a majority of digital possibilities. But I think that the film will remain, and I hope it will, because it's not only the possibilities to produce film stock, but it's also all the knowledge of a technology that has been with film for over 100 years.
Because there's a common belief that digitization is kind of saving those films that are disappearing. And however, many film archives and archivists and restoration think, and this informs also the practice, that still photochemical technology was considered safer because of this problem of the storage, because of the obsolescence of formats, which are changing all the time. But also, for example, is there any new problems for the film restoration because of kind of digital decay? Do you have to deal with it? For example, like the bits damaging. Is this also this digital film is disappearing and getting destroyed with time?
Yeah, of course. But I'm really critical of the idea that photochemical technology was safer. We lost so much film heritage. I mean, it was also human doing, so it was not a question of the technology. But and of course, we are losing a lot of data, not only film, but in general, because the data storage is something that the problems and limits and the challenges of data storage is something that has been understood and tackled much later than all the digitization projects started, but now it's taken very seriously. So in that sense, I don't think it will be solved, like we'll find a way to keep everything forever, but I think it doesn't make it less safe than photochemical. The point is, we have a tradition and expertise that amounts of more than 100 years with photochemical. We know how to handle it. So after having lost and misplaced and destroyed films for a century, finally we got it, and by the time we knew how to keep them safe, something else came about, and now we have to move to that. But again, that's part of the deal. Film is now shot digital, so that's the film heritage we have to store and keep safe.
the 4 frameworks, or now more than 4 frameworks you propose, are also some kind of theories which back the archiving policies. So they can be linked to direct archives which deal with, make decisions for the film, like for film as original, when we treat this material artifact as the most important element of the film heritage. So important that it's even more important than to preserve the film that's showing into the people, to the publics. So some archives, in the most extreme case, decide to freeze all the films because it's the best way to preserve them. So the frameworks you describe in form can be related to direct policies, and maybe we can now switch to your work, and you propose this mindset, and also, as you explained, the institution you work for, or in the past it was the Netherlands Film Museum, now it's the new name, I Film Institute. You positing in the framework of film as dispositive framework. So maybe you could tell us about how your theorization informs your work, and what do you do with this dispositive idea in I Film Institute now?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question that allows me to point out a problem I have every day with myself, and I had when I was working on this book, and that is that I'm always wearing at least 2 hats, the one of the researcher who tries to keep a safe distance from the object of her research, and the hat of someone working for a film archive with a specific policy, as you are pointing out, and who is in a position also to influence that specific policy. So I'm completely aware of that, and I try as much as possible to keep these 2 personalities not too much influencing each other, but that's of course almost impossible. When I associated the history and practice of the Netherlands Film Museum with the film as dispositive framework, was really much based on what the tradition of the Netherlands Film Museum has been until the 80s. A museum that has experimented very much with different ways of presenting its collection. Experimenting with new contemporary musical accompaniment for silent films, with compilation films like Bits and Pieces, also used outside the typical film projection experience. If your question was not explicitly that, but I make it, is I today, since its opening in the new building in 2012, still a good example of the film as dispositive framework? I think so, in many ways, because there is a will to present films in different dispositives within the building itself, going from the more interactive presentations to the exhibition that really, the temporary exhibitions that really explore film when it's what we call with a broader term, expanded cinema, film when it's shown in a museal space, to film theaters that show film projection, both digital and traditional. So I think there is a continuity there, indeed. But that was not your question.
My question was also about the current practice of AI Film Museum, and one of the projects you opened up the space for in your presentation with this framework document monument was actually this book and this project, Fantasia of Color in Early Cinema. Maybe you can circulate this book here, which basically, this is a project which consists of scanned nitrate negatives of early silent color, of early color films. So, could you talk a little bit about this project within this framework you proposed and this switch in your interest?
Just a few words to explain what this project is about. This project started many years ago, say about 6 years ago, from an idea by Tom Gunning to make an illustrated volume focusing on colored early cinema, and especially on the fantastic use of color in early cinema. So by 2012, we decided to make this project reality with a team that involved Tom Gunning, Joshua Yumibe, myself, Jonathan Rosen, someone coming from outside the film archival and media studies, illustrator. So we wanted someone looking at these images from another perspective. Elif Rongen Kainakci, the curator of silent cinema at I. So the way we went about with this book was really to spend days and days watching films from the early cinema collection, colored films from the early cinema collection at I, and select those images that we thought were representative of the fantastic use of color between 1897, roughly, the oldest image in the book, and 1914. So the book itself contains 4 essays, but mainly about 300 full-size reproduction. These reproductions were made scanning the original nitrate, so these are all nitrate positives, vintage copies, so as they were shown at the time. So scanning from the nitrate at a very high resolution. So it's about 4800 dot per inch, 5K at cinema resolution. And indeed, we created in a way a document, but at the same time, we also created a monument in the sense that all these images are now new objects in the archive, and in a form that was never there. These images were never intended to be shown as a single still frames. A colleague of mine asked me when I tried to explain what we were doing, she said, "Oh, you are making photography out of films." I guess that's a way to put it.
Maybe we can open the floor for the question and comments. There are several microphones on in the room, so please, if you would like to take the voice.
Hi. I have a question for Giovanna in the sense of in the direction of access. And from your position, I'm asking this in your position as inside an institution. I mean, how have you seen the question of access evolve through those years, and how are you thinking of involving the public in terms of access and participation in the archive?
Yeah, no, this is clearly something that has evolved radically in the past 10 years, and both in terms of political priorities, institutional priorities, but also in the way archivists approach their work. I think that in the past, for various reasons, we don't have the time to discuss it, archivists were very protective of the collections. And this attitude is changing. They understand that caring for the collection doesn't mean to keep it locked and inaccessible. Things have changed, and the public, of course, because of new participatory platforms, the public ask for access. So it's a double way. I mean, it comes from the institutions, but it's also a demand. That said, there is still very little accessible, very little. There are a number of reasons why. An archive like the one I work with, they've changed. We've changed very much, and I think now my institution is ready to give access to its collection. Why is the online presence of Film Museum so ridiculous, small, ridiculous in that sense today? There are a number of reasons, but especially copyrights. Copyrights is really a problem. So of the collection we have, the films we have in the collection, now I'm focusing on film, but for film-related posters and stills, it's not very different. The collection in public domain, what is digitized, we are slowly but surely putting everything online. Orphan works now, thanks to new European normatives and new legislation in the Netherlands, it's also possible to publish online orphan works. But we are still talking about a very small selection of the collection. And small, I'm talking about a couple of thousand of titles in a collection of 40,000. And for the rest, it's still very difficult. You have basically to clear the rights with every single right owner. And that's something that it's even more time-consuming and expensive than digitizing the films. That was our problem a few years back.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, thank you for the presentation. I'm interested in the ethics of archiving, and by extension, the ethics of curating. So I would love to hear about some of your thoughts about your sort of ethical considerations of your work, the work of your colleagues, the work of other archivists, other curators, and how it plays into this idea of selection in terms of restoration, in terms of presentation. And a follow-up to that, maybe it's not related, I'm interested in this idea the document is a monument. And I would also love to hear your thoughts on, do you sort of approach films and your archival material as monuments, and how do you care for them as monuments, or is that somehow too, we tend to look up at monuments and sort of prostrate ourselves before them in some ways. And monuments obviously sort of get swept away in history and determined by the political winds. So I'm curious about your thought on the film document as a potential monument.
Yeah. Thank you for these questions. I'll start with the second one, because I think it will also relate somehow to the first. My idea is really that monuments, documents, and events should be seen as overlapping filters, and that its object, in a way, in a film archive, can be looked through these different filters. So in a way, for a film archivist, every item in the collection must be treated as a monument, because the archivist is responsible to care for it, but also be interpreted as a document, indeed. And in a way, we all need to be aware of these two aspects of the collections, and also be aware of the fact that every time these objects, monuments, documents, whatever they are shown, it's a specific event. So every time, in my archive there is, well, related to the film as dispositif framework we were discussing earlier, has a very strong conscious and unconscious, I wouldn't call it preference, but there is, the event is very central. On the other hand, an archive is always it's a big community. At the Film Museum there are about 100 people working. Some people work at programming, other people work with the archive. Even if the policy is one, the people working there are many different ones, and they don't all necessarily share the same ideas about the collection and how it should be preserved, restored, and shown. And I think that some of the ideas of film archivists and curators or the past are associated with what archives used to be, a place where usually one curator for a relatively long time would decide about how to preserve, show, and present archives. And now, kind of, when we talk about archives and history of archives, we are always bound to go back to the well-known Langlois-Lindgren discussion. So two very different perspectives on film archiving. Henri Langlois, you are all familiar, represents, and it's maybe more a later interpretation of the real history, but he represents the perspective films must be shown, and that's the, so never mind if that's going to lead to the destruction of the objects, they must be shown. Lindgren had a clear opposite vision. The archives' main aim is to preserve, and if showing means destroying the archive, the collection, then it won't be shown. This is, of course, an extreme. I mean, by now there are several scholars who've written about this this discussion and pointed out the nuances, among other Caroline Frick in her Saving Cinema. But these are also the representation of two very strong ethic of film archiving and conception of what you do with monuments, in a way. I don't know if this is, I kind of wandered around. I hope I answered your questions a little bit. I see two questions there.
Oh.
Hi, Giovanna. I have a question that I think Łukasz already touched upon when he mentioned the concept of transition that you mentioned here, and also which forms the title of your great book. Transition has advantages in that it somehow describes a process, something that is ongoing, and you underline very well in your book how you don't see it as like a finite process from A to B, but rather as a continuous ongoing process. I agree with that, but I also wonder if it doesn't have a certain finality to it. You go from grain to pixel. There is a from and to construction in this idea of a transition. And I wonder if, at least when it comes to film archives with analog holdings and also digitizations of these analog holdings, whether we couldn't and even shouldn't rather think of them in terms of superimposed archives or compound archives, because we have to, in our new archival situation, think about the configuration between the analog and the digital. What are the different digital versions that we make of the analog material? What is the digital restoration? What is the digital intermediate, the digital master? What is the low resolution versions that we put online, etc., for streaming? There are lots of different versions, and that makes a kind of different situation from the previous analog situation. So I'm wondering, not entirely, but some different constructions and configurations are there. So I wonder if it's not only a transition from and to, but also a new situation where you have a multiple format situation or a kind of superimposed archive with different versions.
Yep. No, and first of all, transition. I completely see your point, and Łukasz's point as well. Transition has this direction. That's clear. And I think I could agree with you that maybe another term could be better. On the other hand, the choice for transition also has to do with considering the a social construction of technology. I also consider in my book, and I think that all the actors, and I'm talking about film archivists, but also filmmakers and technicians and everybody that is concerned with the film technology feels that sense of direction. So it's something that needs to be acknowledged. So even if we stress the fact that transition is also always ongoing, I think that that sense that we are going towards a new, different technology is felt very much by the field at large. Said that, I completely agree with you. It's we are moving to more complex archives than we knew in the past, in the analogical past. Although I don't think it's such a huge difference, especially in terms of versions, because what we've done in film archives forever is to make new copies, make a 16mm reduction of a 35mm film in the past to make an access copy, and very often that 16mm is the only one that has survived, making 35 safety copies of nitrate original. So creating new versions is pretty much what film archives have always done, or even in the past, maybe even cutting up copies together to try to make the complete version of a title. So in that sense, what you have with digital is that the new copies are on a digital format that theoretically, and I'm definitely not saying we are there, it's easier to track digital copies than analog copies. It's easier to it should be easier to make sure that you know when the version was made, what are the difference between different versions. Whereas the historical versions made by archives in the past, very often there is no documentation. So you really have to do archaeological work to understand how those versions came about. So I agree with some remarks.
So one question here and one question there, maybe.
So if I may ask, as a fellow archivist, if the academic community in massive quantity chose to truly consider analog heritage a monument, and thus, for example, we're demanding access to the vintage positives of the Desmet collection, how would you feel I could possibly deal with this kind of access wish? Would you choose recourse to a rewind, or would you show the can, or would you just refer to the simulation, be it digital or analog?
Well, first of all, I would be very happy if the film academic community would massively come to eye to look at the collection, and I think we could figure out a way. We are opening next year, finally, the new collection center in Amsterdam North, which is the real milestone for the archive. I mean, of course, opening the new museum was great, but now, finally, after 70 years, we'll have a new proper storage for the collection, but also a place for you all to come and access the collection. And of course, we'll have to probably critically screen why you need access to the very original, but theoretically speaking, if your research question needs access to the original, I think it should be granted. So I hope you won't all come and ask for the same film and the same nitrate at the same time, because we would have a problem.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Here. I was wondering just whether it makes sense to have some kind of tension between the notion of archive and the notion of museum. And it kind of, it continues on what is just said. So the difference, is it useful to have a difference between accessibility and display? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good one, and I do think there is a difference, and this brings me to something I really think it's very important. I think I'm very happy there is this new stress on accessibility, and I do think archives should ideally make everything accessible. In earlier work with Nana Verhoef, we've analyzed two ways archives operate. One is the traditional, what we call the chaperone model, so a way to display, kind of the museum, traditional museum display with a story. The archivist, the curator's story, explaining why an object is important, etc., etc. Today, the possibility to have both ways make collections as open as possible, accessible for everybody, and at the same time also that traditional display mode typical of museums, which is still very much on demand. So I think this community would probably prefer mainly the complete open access model, which I think could really coexist with the traditional museum display model.
Hi Giovanna, hi everybody. I was wondering if like your presentation started from the question, what is film heritage? And I was wondering if like the category of heritage itself has ever been like problematic for you to work with, and I am referring here especially to Caroline Frick's discussion of heritage and of how it kind of, especially within like the European context, which is a continent with a longer history in comparison to the United States, like how the idea of heritage kind of naturalizes the genealogy behind it and the kind of connections with property itself, and how it conceals the narratives behind behind it, and if perhaps like talking about heritage kind of conceals the question, whose heritage is it? So have you ever found this category problematic for you?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think everybody involved with heritage should find it problematic, because it is. And I think another consequence of the cultural shift, and it's really not only technological, as we all know, is that that heritage that we all took for granted, oh, that's heritage, that's a monument, it's our heritage, is problematized. And the question, what is heritage, why is that heritage and something else not? I mean, things that have been, of course, already discussed, Derrida, but also 15 years ago, a very important piece by William Oricchio, The Archive of Absences, focusing specifically on film archives and television archives. Yeah, what has been arbitrary in the past, now it's a big question mark. And I do think, I mean, I don't have any answer, but I don't think that answers at this point are even the point. It's important that the question exists. I mean, it's like, what is film? The question is more important than the answers in many ways, and I think that we need to keep asking these questions to institutions like mine, because we need to explain to everybody, well, in institutional and political terms, would be to the taxpayers, why we choose something to be heritage and worth preserving and something else not. So, yeah.
One of the effects of the ongoing digitization is the increasing interest in the materiality of film. So maybe as a concluding question, I could ask you, how does the film smell?
How does the film smell?
Smell?
Bad. Yeah, no, I really love film in all its forms, but I don't love it because of its smell. And I mean, maybe what's that John Walter's film in Smellorama? That's the only kind of smell of cinema I care for.
Mm-hmm. And concerning the senses, there's a reception waiting for us upstairs, so maybe we can use this moment for a transition upstairs to the reception place. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for your attention.